Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pathways to Results or PTR series of coffee break webinars for the spring of 2019. This webinar is on understanding the implications of deficit mindsets and is the first of three in this series. My name is Chadwick James-Gallaway, and I will be presenting this presentation to you. Before I get started, I would like to welcome a new member to OCCRL and PTR. Her name is on the slides as well, which is Brandy Neal. Brandy is a new research associate that has started working with PTR. She is brilliant. She is a rising superstar. She helped plan many of these slides, and you all will be seeing and hearing more of her in the very near future. With that said, we will jump in to these slides. So before getting started, as always, we just want to go over quickly just the mission and the kind of the goals of OCCRL. Of course, they stretch across four areas: public engagement, transformative leadership, comprehensive P through 20 educational pathways, and of course, equity-driven change. OCCRL's researchers study policies, programs, and practices designed to enhance outcomes for diverse youth and adults who seek to transition to and through college to employment. So in talking about deficit mindsets, what is a deficit mindset? It is very important to understand the context of where these deficit mindsets are coming from and kind of how they affect our students and communities that our students live in. So in the terms of education, a deficit mindset comes from basically implicit biases that we all have. And it's very important for us to spend time working on these implicit biases and learning where they come from and how we can undo them. One thing that I would like to push everyone who's watching this webinar to do is to really focus on the gifts that our students are bringing to the table, the gifts that our students are bringing with them into the classroom, because harmful and deficit mindsets really affect our success of our students on our college campuses. Deficit mindsets are also very pervasive in this society, and they're often very permanent in this society. And in schools and teachers, educators often mirror these beliefs. Harmful deficit mindsets happen when we believe that someone is deficient for what they do not have, or if a person has something that another person does not have. For example, looking down on someone or a group for their differences. I will cover examples of these mindsets that show up on some of the college campuses. So in terms of focusing on why deficit mindsets are important, traditionally social theorists have identified the educational system as one of the most important social institutions, as it controls the knowledge of transfer and controls the transfer of knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions about people. P through 20 education is trying to normalize that every student is gifted and talented. Every student is gifted and talented. There's not one student that is better or more gifted or more talented than another. That every student has something that they bring with them to the table, that no student is deficient, and that everyone has a gift that should be celebrated and uplifted. However, we cannot just focus on deficit mindsets. As I've already said, we have to understand where they come from. We also have to understand that education historically within the United States has largely supported the dominant middle and upper class. And though education can be seen as a great equalizer, as long as deficit mindsets continues to exist, we have to challenge that notion that education is in fact that equalizer. So hopping into pitfalls of deficit mindsets, things that happen a lot that also was showcased in the literature is writing students off before they even come to school, before they even walk in the building, making generalizations about family backgrounds, who these students are, where they come from, their likes, their dislikes, and really why they're in this building. Basically, anything and everything that thinks negatively, excuse me, or from a deficit perspective about a student. Overgeneralizations about where people come from, and of course, being culturally sensitive does not mean that you cannot have deficit mindset. So one of the things that always happens when we kind of go and do different presentations is that sometimes people think that because they're culturally sensitive or because they're social justice advocates, that they may not hold deficit mindsets. And that is untrue. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that even people that constantly work on deficit mindsets and asset-based practices can also maintain and hold these deficit views. So there are a few examples of deficit mindsets that I will go over today. Many believe that the only way to speak English, right, speaking proper English, is to speak, the proper standard English with proper pronunciation. And that's the only right way to speak, right? That's something that is often said within colleges, universities, and K through 12 schools. And many believe that speaking, the African American Vernacular, or AAVE, is incorrect or wrong, or speaking slang is incorrect or wrong, or speaking a mix of Spanish and English is incorrect or wrong, or speaking a mix of someone's first and second language is incorrect and wrong. There's also the belief that people who have accents are not intelligent, that if English is their foundational language, that they should be speaking the language without an accent. Again, focusing on what is proper or what is improper. And one of the things that we always stress is that there is no proper way to speak, right? The words form out our mouths, and we have to respect how they form for other people who may be different and grow up in different environments from us. But this one deficit mindset that we really wanted to focus on. And lastly, there's professional dress versus cultural dress versus actually clothes owned, right? And this is more of a deficit mindset around class and also where people may be from. Of course, we're not saying, don't show up to an environment without having your best dressed clothes on, but that can look very different for different people depending on where they come from. And that can also look different based off of people's financial resources that they have. So in terms of where deficit mindsets come from, as I've already alluded to in a previous slide, education really has focused on the dominant middle and upper class, existing with social differences. And education has been a place where some of these differences have been perpetuated and even have increased for some. One of the things that we have to work on in terms of the system of education is making sure that harmful and false stereotypes that are often created by the privileged group are being squashed out so they no longer exist on our college campuses and, of course, within our P through 20 system as a whole. One of the things that we also have to understand is that people of marginalization are often unable to control their image, their viewpoint, and what people think and perceive about them. So one example of this comes from this mindset and belief that low-income families, low social economic status families, do not value education. And that is a huge deficit mindset. Studies have shown that low-income families value education at the same level and higher than their wealthier counterparts. But again, an often stereotype that is being told in the narrative of education is that low-income families, again, do not care about education. Moving forward and talking about conversations about race, another mindset is that Blacks and Hispanics do not care about education. However, this mindset has been proven false by a research study done by the Pew Research Center. So if you look at the charts on your screen, again, the popular belief has been held that Blacks and Hispanics or Latinx do not care about education. Again, but this is very untrue. Well, looking at the graph, it is clear to see that whites are actually at the bottom in terms of value placed on a college degree. Now, I'm not advocating for the graph to say, hey, look, who does not care about education? I'm not saying that this group or that group does not care about education. That's not what I'm trying to do with this graph. But I did want to use this graph in order to highlight and kind of push back against popular beliefs in terms of people of color and stereotypes that they do not typically care about education or higher education in general, because it's simply false and not true. They do care. Another deficit mindset that again kind of comes out of class and social economic status is the funding of schools and school districts. So these notes come from EdBuild, which is a nonprofit organization. And essentially with this slide, I really wanted to get down to the brass tacks of it all. Funding of schools in this country is not equal nor equitable. Non-white school districts receive less funding than white districts. Non-white districts, however, serve a larger student population with less money. Even in districts where there are poor or low socioeconomic status white students, the white schools will still receive more funding than non-white schools. School funding is tied to school resources, and a lack of resources in a school can lead to what we perceive about the community that the school is in, as well as the people who went to that school or the people who live in that community. So again, it's very important not to judge a book by its cover. And we also have to understand the context that the funding differences in the United States right now is very unfair. It is not equitable, and it does not serve all people in all communities fairly. And sometimes deficit mindsets can be created about schools because of the lack of resources that they have, which is no fault of their own. So in talking about the major keys of deficit mindsets, really quickly, there is no right way to dress, speak, or talk. And if that's the only thing you take away from this webinar, great. Hopefully you take away more, but if that's the only thing you take away, then that's great. There is no right way to speak, dress, or talk, which is recapping some of our earlier slides. There are preconceived notions that often dictated to us based on our various social identity groups, privileges, and marginalization. So we always are talking about social identities here at PTR and OCCRL. We're always talking about privilege and marginalization. And based on our various social identity groups, there are mindsets that we can have that can be deficit-based and or asset-based. And we have to understand how our social identities are impacted by these deficit mindsets, but how we also may use these deficit mindsets in situations that may be sexist and or racist and or classist and or any mix of isms. Deficit mindsets are often connected to certain types of isms that are based in our society. So how do we solve issues of deficit mindsets? Well, we have to understand that we are battling a systems of oppression. And in order to battle these systems of oppression, we also have to realize that we are battling certain ideologies. Racism will not end unless we understand and dismantle white supremacy. We cannot end racism by celebrating diversity and ignoring institutional and structural racism. Deficit mindsets are also connected to institutional and structural racism. Sexism will not end unless we understand and dismantle patriarchy. We cannot end sexism without focusing on ending the system of patriarchy in our society. There are a lot of deficit mindsets that are connected to patriarchy in our society. Classism also will not end unless we understand and dismantle capitalism. We cannot end classism unless we understand economic freedom and economic justice. And a lot of class-based assumptions about deficit mindsets are also based in classism. So changing our deficit mindsets in order to do that, we have to focus on really two areas. One of which we'll cover today, and the other we won't really be able to get into right now, but I'll talk a little bit about. The first one is culturally relevant pedagogy, and the second one, which we won't be able to get heavily into, is community cultural wealth. And really quickly, community cultural wealth focuses on and really captures the talents, the strengths, and experiences that students of color bring with them to their classrooms and their college environments, right? We're talking about aspirational capital, linguistic capital, familial capital, social capital, navigational and resistant capital, all of these things in which marginalized groups deal with and bring with them as they move throughout society. All of these things are assets. We also have to understand how our system of education, again, as I've already said, has been kind of set up to privilege certain groups in society, right? We've been talking about the middle class and upper class groups, and to marginalize other groups in our society. Things like standardized test scores and levels of educational attainment are constantly used to point out deficiencies of historically marginalized communities. So in terms of creating equitable environments, there has to be a willingness to focus and interrogate ourselves, to focus on change and interrogate ourselves and our actions. We have to admit that we have issues or problems, right? Whether that's with ourselves, whether that's with our institutions, our schools, where we work, who we associate ourselves with. We have to be able to focus on these race-based, class-based, gender-based, class-based, sexual orientation-based issues. All of these social identities are connected to these deficit mindsets. We have to be real with our history. One of the things that always bothers me when talking with different people and doing certain sessions is certain people, certain schools will say, well, we don't have a race problem. Our office doesn't have a gender problem. We don't have a class problem. We don't have any issues here at all whatsoever that would connote that there is an inequity in our school or our workspace. And for me, that's simply not true. There's always something that can be focused on. No place is completely free of these issues and our isms, because these were the isms that our society was founded upon. One example of this is I did my undergrad at the University of Michigan. It's touted as one of the most diverse schools in the country. And if you pull up or you type into Google race issues, race climate, University of Michigan, anything like that, there will be things that pop up. There are issues that pop up again on one of the most diverse institutional campuses in the country, right? And one of the things that I always say is, if this campus, if the University of Michigan has all these issues that go on at its campus, then what is happening at campuses or colleges, community colleges, universities, workplaces that do not have all of these resources tied up in improving diversity, equity, and inclusion? If you are unsure, or if you say there is not a problem around race, class, gender, etc., you probably have a problem there. You may not be seeing it. So really quickly before we close, I wanted to kind of hop into culturally relevant pedagogy. And in terms of talking about culturally relevant pedagogy, it's not just something that can be used for instructors or people who are in front of students teaching. It can also be used for staff and administrators. And there might be a little bit of finagling that has to be done in order to fit these three criteria. But they are very important. They are very impactful for students of marginality. So of course, the first one is focusing on academic achievement, which is basically learning and rigor, so like the teaching side of it. And then there's these other two buckets that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about in terms of cultural competency and sociopolitical consciousness. So cultural competency is understanding of one's own cultural background and the background of students they serve, right? So again, whether you are a teacher, a staff member, a faculty member, an administrator, it is very important to understand your own cultural background, the cultural background that you come from, but also the background of the students you serve, and how that may be different. In terms of social political consciousness, it requires that educators educate themselves on the students that they serve, right? So it's kind of mixing that cultural competency piece in with the social political consciousness, right? What do you know about the students that you serve? Because there's definitely more than one culture. There's multiple cultures, there's multiple students. They're not all the same. They're not all coming from the same place. And in terms of making sure that we understand the social political consciousness of ourselves and our students, it really makes a difference on our college campuses, in our college classrooms, creating spaces that are diverse, equitable, and inclusive for all student groups. There is not one size fits all model to creating a diverse and equitable climate. And also there's not a one size model to ending some of these deficit mindsets. But if we understand where our students come from and more about them, we can better understand what deficit mindsets we might need to work out of our educational institutions and what asset-based mindsets we need to insert into our educational institutions to understand how to best serve our students. So research shows that culturally relevant pedagogy plays an important role in the social integration and academic integration of students. This is because it provides a sense of belonging for students on the campuses and in the classrooms. It is very important for students of marginalized groups to see themselves, their culture, people who look like them, people who come from similar experiences in the material that is taught. It is also important for teachers and practitioners of education to learn about and understand the cultural background of their students. This is especially important for outsiders of the community. Another personal example of this would be personally for me. I was a teacher in New Orleans for a few years, and I'm not from New Orleans. I'm a kid from Michigan. And going to New Orleans was a very distinct cultural experience that I never had in my entire life. And it's a different way of life in New Orleans. And for me as an outsider in that community, as a Black man, even though I was going to a very homogenous Black community, I still had to understand things about the culture because I didn't grow up in it. I'm not from it, but my students and the parents that I taught were from that culture. They were from that community. And making those strides to understand their experiences, to understand the history of New Orleans, the history of education in New Orleans, and how people, have been treated in New Orleans was very, very important to my success as the teacher. The best way that I could say the people from New Orleans helped me is that they were the experts. They taught me everything, and I just sat back, I listened, I asked questions, I learned from them. And again, I'll just repeat that. The people from the community are the experts. So major keys of enacting CRP, culturally relevant pedagogy, there's no set of strategies or directions, right? It's really a lot of trial and error and listening to the people in the community, listening to your students about what they need. It's very proactive, and it's very proactive, but it's also reactive at the same time. It's a little bit of both. CRP also must be connected to the individual and educators and their students. One thing about CRP is that, again, it's not a one size fits all model. Each student is different and they have to be treated differently. Your actions and your policies should also be driven by CRP, right? Culturally relevant pedagogy, which is academic achievement, cultural competency, and the social political consciousness needs of your student population, which is kind of why we spent time on that last couple of slides talking about learning about the community and understanding what it is that they need to be successful. Not about what you need, but what does your students need? What are the needs of the community in order for them to be successful at your institution, at your college? As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about these slides or any other presentations, please do not hesitate to reach out to the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. Thank you so much for coming to this coffee break webinar presentation. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you all in the future.